The engine noise came first, a low rumble building from the horizon, growing louder until it sounded like thunder rolling across the interstate. Patrick had been sitting on that bench for 6 hours, watching every car pass, waiting for a family that would never return. He didn't know yet that one stranger's decision to stop, to sit down, to say you're not alone, was about to multiply into something no one could have predicted. 500 motorcycles were coming, 500 strangers who knew nothing about him except that he'd been left behind. What none of them knew was how far this single afternoon would travel, or how completely it would rewrite what family meant. Scott Bradley had been riding motorcycles for 31 years, and he had never once believed that a rest stop off Interstate 40 could change the direction of his entire life. To him, the Watt Road rest area outside Knoxville, Tennessee, was just another patch of asphalt and vending machines, a place where truckers stretched their legs before another 6 hours on the road. It smelled like diesel fumes and pine trees, and on a humid Tuesday afternoon in late September, it looked exactly like it always did. Scott pulled his Harley-Davidson Road King into the parking lot a little after 4 o'clock, boots dusty from the ride down from Nashville. He was 47, built like a man who had spent 2 decades fixing engines, with a grey-streaked beard and a leather vest carrying the patch of the Blue Ridge Riders, a club he had belonged to since he was 26. He ran a small repair shop, Bradley's Motor Works, built from nothing after his divorce 8 years earlier. He was not a sentimental man, or at least he liked to think he wasn't. His daughter Megan was 22 and lived in Atlanta, and they spoke on the phone every other Sunday, brief conversations between 2 people who loved each other but no longer knew how to fill the silences. His shop kept him busy 12 hours a day. His club kept him from being entirely alone. That afternoon, Scott had stopped at the rest area for the same reason he always did, to stretch his legs, drink a cup of gas station coffee, and check the weather before deciding whether to keep riding toward the mountains or turn back home. He noticed the man on the bench almost by accident, out of the corner of his eye, the way you notice something before you understand why it caught your attention. The man was sitting very still on a green metal bench near the vending machines, wearing a red flannel shirt and jeans slightly too short at the ankle. He had a backpack at his feet and was holding a small paper bag in both hands as if it was something precious. He looked to be in his 30s, with the round, gentle features Scott recognized after a moment as belonging to someone with Down syndrome. What struck Scott first was not the man's appearance, but his posture. Shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the parking lot exit, watching every car that passed with an intensity that made Scott's chest tighten before he understood why. Scott walked past him once, toward the vending machines, and told himself it was none of his business. People waited for family members at rest stops all the time. But 20 minutes later, when Scott came back outside with his coffee, the man was still there, in the exact same position, and the sun had begun to dip lower over the tree line. The parking lot had changed, different cars, different families, but the man had not moved. His eyes were still fixed on the exit ramp, waiting for a vehicle that never seemed to come. Scott hesitated by his motorcycle, keys in hand, engine cold. Something about the stillness of the man's posture, the way his hands trembled slightly around the paper bag, told Scott this was not an ordinary wait. He walked over. "Hey there," Scott said, keeping his voice low and easy, the same tone he used with nervous dogs and skittish customers. "Mind if I sit down for a second?" The man looked up at him, startled, then nodded slowly. Up close, Scott could see he was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, with kind brown eyes that darted between Scott's face and the parking lot behind him, as though afraid of missing something. "I'm Scott," he said, lowering himself onto the bench, keeping a respectful distance. "What's your name?" "Patrick," the man said, his voice soft but clear. "Patrick Whitfield. Good to meet you, Patrick. You waiting on somebody?" Patrick nodded, gripping the paper bag tighter. My family. They went to get gas. They said, wait here. They said, don't move. Scott glanced at the gas station across the lot, its pumps visible from where they sat. No unusual line. No long wait. He looked back at Patrick's face and saw something that made his stomach drop. Not confusion, but a kind of quiet, practiced patience, the look of someone who had been told to wait before and had learned not to ask too many questions. How long you been sitting here, Patrick? Patrick thought about it, counting on his fingers the way a child might, though Scott would later learn he was 34 years old. A long time, he finally said. Since lunch, I had a sandwich. Turkey. Scott checked his watch. It was almost 5. 4 hours was not a bathroom break or a gas station line. It was something else entirely, and a cold, uneasy feeling was already settling into his chest. You got a phone number for your family? Somebody I could call, let them know you're doing fine? Patrick shook his head. They have the phone. Mom has the phone. Scott sat with that for a moment, the late afternoon light slanting gold through the pine trees, truckers coming and going, oblivious to the two of them on the bench. He thought about walking away, telling himself this was a misunderstanding that would resolve itself soon. But something in Patrick's careful stillness, the way he clutched that paper bag, like it was the only certain thing left in his world, told Scott otherwise. Tell you what, Scott said, standing up slowly so as not to startle him. I'm going to stick around a little while, just to keep you company. That all right with you? Patrick looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face shifted. Not quite relief, but the beginning of it, a small crack of light in an expression that had been holding itself together through sheer will. Okay, Patrick said. Thank you, Scott. Scott sat back down, pulled out his phone, and quietly began typing a message to his motorcycle club, though he did not yet know how large that message was about to become, or how many lives it would eventually touch. He only knew that the sun was setting, that a grown man was sitting alone in a parking lot with a sandwich bag and a story that did not add up, and that somebody needed to stay until the truth came out. By 6 o'clock, the rest stop had grown quieter, the dinner-hour lull when fewer cars pulled off the interstate. Scott had bought Patrick a bottle of water and a bag of pretzels from the vending machine, and the two of them sat together as the sky shifted from gold to a deep, bruised orange. Scott had learned in the space of 2 hours that Patrick loved country music, especially George Strait, that he could name every stop on the Norfolk Southern rail line that ran near his hometown, and that he had a way of describing things, the smell of diesel, the sound of cicadas, with a kind of careful precision that made Scott listen more closely than he usually did. What Scott had not learned, no matter how gently he asked, was why Patrick's family had left him there. They'll come back, Patrick said several times, each time with a little less certainty in his voice. They just went to get gas. Maybe they got lost. Scott did not believe that a family got lost between a gas station and a rest stop bench 300 yards away, but he did not say so. Instead, he called the Tennessee Highway Patrol, keeping his voice low as he stepped a few feet away from Patrick, describing the situation as calmly as he could manage. The trooper, who arrived 20 minutes later, introduced himself as Corporal Danny Osric, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s, with a clipped mustache and a notepad he flipped open before he'd even reached the bench. Osric spoke with Patrick for several minutes. Gently, professionally, the kind of patience that told Scott this was not the first time the trooper had handled a situation involving a vulnerable adult. Patrick gave him a name, Diane Whitfield, his mother, and a town, Sevierville, about 40 minutes away, but no working phone number that anyone could reach. We'll run the plates from any vehicle registered to a Diane Whitfield in that area, Osric told Scott, stepping away from the bench so Patrick wouldn't overhear. But I'll be straight with you. This doesn't look like an accident. Family doesn't accidentally leave for 4 hours, 5 now, without circling back or calling this location directly. Scott felt something tighten in his jaw. You're saying they left him here on purpose? I'm saying, Osric said carefully, that we've seen this before. Not often, but enough times that I recognize the pattern. Families who are overwhelmed, caring for a family member with special needs, sometimes reach a breaking point. Doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it legal either. This could constitute abandonment of a vulnerable adult under Tennessee law. But it happens. The words landed heavier than Scott expected. He looked back at Patrick, who was watching them talk, his hands folded in his lap, trying to read their expressions the way people do when they suspect news is being kept from them. "So, what happens to him now?" Scott asked. "If nobody comes?" "Adult Protective Services will need to get involved. We can put him in temporary emergency placement tonight if we can't locate family, or if family is located and unwilling or unable to take him." Osric paused, glancing toward Patrick. "It's not exactly foster care for adults, but there's a system. It's just not fast, and it's not always kind." Scott felt a knot forming in his stomach at the thought of Patrick spending the night in some unfamiliar facility, surrounded by strangers, after already spending an entire afternoon abandoned on a bench. He thought of his own daughter at that age, how frightened she would have been in a similar situation, how much she would have needed a familiar face. "Give it another hour," Scott said. "Let me make some calls first." He returned to the bench and sat beside Patrick, who immediately asked, "Is Officer Danny going to find my mom?" "He's trying," Scott said honestly. "Patrick, can I ask you something? Has this happened before? Your family leaving you somewhere, even for a little while?" Patrick was quiet for a long moment, turning the empty pretzel bag over in his hands. "Sometimes Mom gets tired," he finally said. "She says I'm a lot of work. My brother Craig says I should live somewhere else. A place for people like me." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and he looked down at his lap. "I don't want to live somewhere else. I want to go home." Scott felt his throat tighten in a way he hadn't expected. He had fixed 1,000 engines in his life, had solved 1,000 mechanical problems with steady hands and patient reasoning, but there was no wrench for this, no manual that told him how to fix a family's abandonment of the person who needed them most. He pulled out his phone and opened a group text to the Blue Ridge Riders, 30 members strong, men and women he had ridden beside for 2 decades, through funerals, weddings, charity runs, and long summer nights on back roads that stretched toward nowhere in particular. Need eyes and hands at Watt Road, rest stop off I-40. Grown man left here by his family hours ago. Might need to make some noise to get this handled right. Who's close? Within 10 minutes, 3 replies came back. Within 30, 7 more. His club president, a retired firefighter named Walt Bishop, called him directly. "Talk to me, Scott. What do you need?" Scott explained the situation as plainly as he could. Patrick, the abandonment, the trooper's warning about how slow and impersonal the system could be. Walt listened without interrupting, the way he always did before making a decision. "You think this family's really not coming back?" "I think," Scott said, looking over at Patrick, who had begun humming softly to himself a country tune Scott didn't recognize, "that whatever happens tonight, this man needs to know somebody in this world showed up for him, even if it's just us." There was a pause on the line. "Give me an hour," Walt said. "I'm going to make some calls of my own." Scott didn't fully understand what Walt meant by that until nearly 2 hours later, when the first distant rumble of motorcycle engines began drifting across the interstate, faint at first, then unmistakable, growing louder with every passing minute. A sound that would soon become impossible to ignore, not just for the rest stop, but for an entire family that had assumed no one would ever find out what they had done. By 9 o'clock that night, Corporal Osric had confirmed what Scott had begun to suspect hours earlier. A vehicle registered to Diane Whitfield had been traced through automated license plate readers along Interstate 40, traveling east, away from Knoxville towards Sevierville, and it had not turned back. When Osric finally reached Diane Whitfield by phone, the conversation, which he relayed to Scott afterward in careful, measured words, revealed something far more troubling than a simple mistake. Diane Whitfield had known exactly where her son was. She admitted, according to Osric, that the family had struggled for years to manage Patrick's care, that her husband had passed away 3 years earlier, that her younger son, Craig, had recently moved back home with financial troubles of his own, and that the household had reached what she called a breaking point. She had convinced herself that someone would eventually notice Patrick and call for help, that the system would somehow absorb him into care designed for people in his situation, a solution she could not fully justify even to herself. "She's not coming back tonight," Osric told Scott quietly, stepping away from the growing crowd of motorcycles now filling the rest stop parking lot. "She says she needs time, says she can't do this anymore. Legally, this is now a case of adult abandonment, and I'll be filing a report that could result in charges, but that doesn't solve the problem of what happens to Patrick right now." Scott exhaled slowly, glancing up at the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to prick through the haze of highway light. 12 hours earlier, he had been a man with a simple plan for his Tuesday. Now he was absorbing the news that a mother had knowingly driven away from her own son and trying to figure out what came next for a man he had known less than a day but already felt responsible for. "Does he know?" Scott asked. "That she's not coming?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." Osric's voice had lost some of its earlier professional distance. "This doesn't get easier because he's an adult. If anything, it's harder. Most of the resources out there are built for kids, not for a 34-year-old man whose mother just decided she was done." Scott looked over at Patrick, who was sitting on a folding camp chair someone had produced from a saddlebag, surrounded by 7 or 8 bikers who had already arrived. Men and women in leather vests, patches from clubs Scott recognized, and some he didn't, drawn not by Walt's original message alone, but by a chain of texts and phone calls that had rippled outward faster than Scott could have predicted. Patrick was laughing at something one of the riders, a heavy-set woman named Ellen Marsh, had said, his earlier fear softened by an evening spent surrounded by strangers who had chosen, again and again, to stay. But Scott also saw, beneath the laughter, the exhaustion in Patrick's eyes, the way his hand kept drifting to that same paper bag, now empty of the sandwich it once held, as though it were the last piece of home he still possessed. Scott pulled Osric aside. "What's the plan if there's no family placement tonight?" "Emergency shelter through Adult Protective Services. It's not ideal. Group setting, unfamiliar staff, and given the hour, it might take another 2 or 3 hours before a caseworker's even available to process it." Osric rubbed the back of his neck. "I know it's not what either of us wants for him." Scott felt the weight of the evening pressing down on him. The sun long gone, motorcycle engines still rumbling in from the highway, and a man who deserved better than a folding chair in a parking lot or a stranger's shelter bed. He thought about his own empty house, unused since his daughter left for college, and considered offering it outright. But he also knew the law did not work that way. A man could not simply take another adult home on the strength of a single evening's kindness, however genuine. Scott had been the one to tell Patrick in the end, choosing his words as carefully as he had ever chosen anything. He had crouched beside the folding chair, kept his voice steady, and explained that his mother needed some time, that she wasn't coming back tonight, but that he was not going to be left alone. Patrick had listened without crying, which somehow made it harder to watch, his face settling into an expression Scott recognized from years of watching customers absorb bad news about engines they couldn't afford to fix. Not shock, but a weary, resigned acceptance, as though some part of him had already expected this outcome long before anyone said it out loud. "She does this," Patrick had said quietly. "Not this big, but she gets tired of me. Craig says I make everything harder." He'd looked up at Scott then, his eyes searching for something. "Am I hard, Scott?" "No," Scott had said, more firmly than he intended, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "You are not hard, Patrick. You are a person who deserves people who show up, that's all. And tonight, you've got a whole parking lot full of them." It was Walt Bishop who found the answer. Arriving just after 10 o'clock on his own motorcycle, a tall, silver-haired man whose calm authority had held the club together for 15 years. He had spent the last 2 hours not riding toward the rest stop, but working the phone, and what he brought with him was not sympathy, but a plan. "I called Marcy Dunlap," Walt said, referring to a long-time club member who worked as a licensed foster and respite care coordinator for adults with disabilities in Knox County. "She's certified for emergency adult placements. She's on her way right now. If Adult Protective Services approves it, and given the circumstances, Osric here can vouch that a stable, background-checked placement beats an overnight shelter bed. Patrick could be somewhere warm and familiar within the hour, with someone connected to people who already care what happens to him." Osric considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can make that call. It'll take some paperwork. But if Ms. Dunlap is willing and certified, I don't see why we'd choose a shelter over a stable home when we've got community support standing right here." Scott felt something loosen in his chest. He walked over to Patrick, crouching so they were eye to eye. "Patrick, we found you a safe place to stay tonight. A woman named Marcy. She's a friend of ours, real kind, and she takes care of folks just like you sometimes. You'll have a warm bed, good food. And I promise you, this isn't going to be like a place where you're forgotten. People are going to check on you. I'm going to check on you." Patrick studied Scott's face for a long moment, searching, the way people search when they've been let down too many times to trust easily. "You promise?" "I promise," Scott said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in years. But even as he said the words, Scott understood that a single night's placement was not the same as a future, that Patrick's mother had made her position clear, and that tomorrow would bring harder questions about where a 34-year-old man, with no other family willing to claim him, was supposed to build the rest of his life. The engines outside kept arriving, more and more of them, and somewhere in the growing rumble of motorcycles, Scott began to sense that this was no longer just his problem to solve alone. News travels strangely in a community built on loyalty. What began as a single text message from Scott Bradley to 30 members of the Blue Ridge Riders had, by midnight, become something far larger than anyone anticipated. Walt Bishop had called contacts in 3 other motorcycle clubs across East Tennessee, the Smoky Mountain Riders, the Cumberland Road Kings, and a veterans riding group called Iron Brotherhood, not to demand action, but simply to share what had happened at the Watt Road rest stop. Each call led to another. Each rider who heard the story felt, in some private way, a piece of themselves in it. A brother left behind, a parent who had struggled, a moment in their own lives when a stranger's kindness had meant the difference between despair and hope. By the time Patrick was safely settled into Marcy Dunlap's home that night, a plan had already begun forming that none of the original riders had fully intended to create. Walt proposed it to Scott over coffee at a 24-hour diner near the interstate, both men running on exhaustion and adrenaline in equal measure. "People want to do something more than just show up for one night," Walt said. "Ellen's already talking about it, Marcy's talking about it. What if we organize something bigger, a ride in Patrick's honor, to raise awareness about adult abandonment cases, maybe raise some money for a proper support fund? Something that says loud and clear that this community isn't going to let a man like Patrick just disappear into a system." Scott turned the idea over carefully. He had never been one for grand gestures. His was a life of small, steady repairs, one engine at a time. But he thought of Patrick's face on that bench, the careful, practiced patience of someone who had learned not to expect much from the people who were supposed to love him most, and he understood that sometimes the right response to quiet abandonment was loud, undeniable presence. "Do it," Scott said. "Call it the ride for Patrick." There was, however, a harder conversation to have first, one Scott insisted on before agreeing to let the idea grow any larger. He drove to Marcy Dunlap's house the next morning and sat with Patrick at her kitchen table, laying out what Walt had proposed as plainly as he could. "This would mean your story goes public," Scott explained. "Reporters, maybe TV cameras. People would know what happened to you, what your mum did. I want you to understand that before anybody else does anything. This is your life, Patrick, not ours. If you don't want this, we'll find another way to help you, quieter, and that's okay too." Patrick considered this for a long moment, turning a coffee mug slowly between his hands. "Will it help other people? Like me?" "That's the hope," Scott said. "Walt thinks if enough people see what happened, it might change how these situations get handled. Might help somebody else who ends up on a bench like you did." "Then I want to do it," Patrick said without hesitation. "I don't want anybody else to wait like I waited." That single sentence, Scott would later tell Walt, settled every doubt either of them had about moving forward. What followed over the next 10 days surprised even Walt, a man not easily surprised. The story of Patrick's abandonment and the response from local bikers had reached a Knoxville news station within 48 hours, picked up first by a local reporter named Renee Castellano, who interviewed Scott outside his repair shop, then Marcy in her living room, and finally, with careful permission and gentle questions, Patrick himself, who spoke haltingly but proudly about his new friends, about George Strait, about the trains he still loved to watch from Marcy's back porch. The story spread beyond Knoxville within days. Regional news picked it up, then a national morning show requested an interview, and social media did what it does best, amplifying a story that touched something raw and universal in anyone who had ever felt overlooked or unwanted. Riders from clubs across Tennessee, then Kentucky, then as far as North Carolina and Virginia, began messaging Walt and Scott, asking how they could participate in the planned ride. What had started as a gathering of 30 motorcycles at a rest stop became, on the second Saturday of October, a procession of exactly 512 riders, though everyone simply called it the 500, gathering in a parking lot outside Knoxville's Chilhowee Park before riding in a slow, thundering column along a 10-mile route that ended at a community center where a fundraiser had been organized. The sound of it, 500 engines idling in unison before the ride began, was something Scott would remember for the rest of his life. A sound like distant thunder made solid and purposeful, a physical manifestation of a promise that Patrick would never again sit alone on a bench, waiting for people who weren't coming back. Patrick rode that day in the sidecar of Walt Bishop's vintage motorcycle, wearing a leather vest the club had made for him, embroidered with his name and the words "honorary member" beneath the club's insignia. Scott rode directly behind them, watching Patrick's face throughout the procession, watching him wave at the crowds that had gathered along the route, watching an expression of pure, unguarded joy replace the wariness that had defined him on that bench 3 weeks earlier. Renee Castellano's segment aired the Thursday before the ride, and within it, Patrick spoke for nearly 90 seconds uninterrupted about the bench, about the fear of watching cars pass without slowing down, about Scott sitting beside him when no one else would. The clip circulated widely, shared not because it was dramatic, but because it was plain and honest, in a way that cut through the noise of everything else competing for attention that week. Strangers began mailing letters to Bradley's Motorworks, some containing small donations, others simply thanking Scott for what he'd done. a handful written by people who confessed they had once been the ones left behind, in one form or another, by families who couldn't or wouldn't carry the weight of caring for them. But amid the celebration, a harder truth still needed to be confronted. Diane Whitfield had been formally charged with abandonment of a vulnerable adult, a Class A misdemeanor under Tennessee law, and while prosecutors indicated they would likely seek a plea agreement involving mandatory counseling and community service rather than jail time, the legal proceedings had opened old wounds that Patrick still carried. 2 days before the ride, Diane had reached out through her attorney, requesting a supervised visit with her son, a request that Marcy Dunlap had relayed to Scott with visible uncertainty in her voice. "He still loves her," Marcy said. "Whatever she did, whatever her reasons, he still asks about her most nights before bed. I don't think we can just shut that door, even after everything." Scott understood in that moment that Patrick's story could not end simply with 500 motorcycles and a fundraiser, however meaningful. The real resolution, the one that mattered most, would have to happen in a quieter room between a mother and a son, with all the complicated grief and guilt and love that no amount of engine noise could fully express. The meeting took place 2 weeks after the ride, in a small conference room at a family counseling center in Knoxville that specialized in adult guardianship and family reunification cases. Scott had not planned to attend, believing it was not his place, but Patrick had asked him directly, in his gentle, unwavering way, and Scott found he could not refuse. Diane Whitfield arrived looking smaller than Scott had imagined her, a woman in her early 60s, with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she sat across the table from her son. She had completed the first several sessions of court-mandated counseling, and the counselor present, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patricia Nunkamelu, had prepared both Diane and Patrick carefully for what this conversation could and could not accomplish. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," Diane said to her son, her voice cracking on the second word. "I know what I did. I know I can't undo it. I was drowning, Patrick. Your father's been gone 3 years, and Craig lost his job, and I kept telling myself I was managing, that I could keep doing it all, and I broke. That's not an excuse, it's just what happened." Patrick sat very still, the same stillness Scott remembered from the bench, though this time his hands were folded calmly in his lap rather than gripping a paper bag for comfort. "You left me," he said simply. "I waited a long time." "I know," Diane said, tears now falling freely. "I think about that every single day. I think about you sitting there waiting, and I hate what I did to you. I hate it." The room was quiet for a long moment before Patrick spoke again. "Scott stayed with me," he said. "He didn't leave. Then more people came, a lot of people, 500, Scott said." Diane looked up at Scott then, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of recognition, one parent to another, of what it meant that a stranger had done for her son, what she, in her exhaustion and grief, had failed to do. "Thank you," Diane said quietly, "for staying with him." Scott nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and let Dr. Nkemelu guide the conversation toward practical matters. Supervised visitation, ongoing family counseling, and most importantly, the question of where Patrick would live moving forward. It was Marcy Dunlap, present as Patrick's temporary caregiver, who proposed the arrangement that would ultimately hold. Patrick would remain in Marcy's care as his official residence, stable and secure, while maintaining a structured, supervised relationship with his mother that could grow slowly as trust was rebuilt on both sides. After the meeting ended, Scott walked Patrick out to the parking lot, both of them quiet, processing the weight of what had just been said. Patrick stopped by Scott's motorcycle, running a hand along the worn leather of the seat. "She looked sad," Patrick said finally. "Sadder than I thought she'd look." "People can be sad about something and still have done wrong," Scott said carefully. "Both things can be true. You don't have to pick just one to believe. Patrick nodded slowly, as though filing the thought away somewhere it could be examined later. I think I can visit her. Not live there, just visit. That sounds like a good plan, Scott said. And whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, you've got people behind you, either way. In the months that followed, Scott's life did not return entirely to what it had been before that Tuesday afternoon at the rest stop, nor did he particularly want it to. He visited Patrick every week, sometimes bringing him to the shop to watch him work on engines, an activity Patrick approached with the same careful, patient fascination he brought to trains and country music. The Blue Ridge Riders, established with proceeds from the Ride for Patrick fundraiser, a small emergency fund specifically for adults facing abandonment or homelessness due to family caregiving breakdowns, a fund that within its first year had already helped 3 other individuals in similar circumstances find stable placements before their situations became crises. The supervised visits with Diane began slowly, once a month at first, always with Dr. Nkemelu or Marcy present, conversations that started stiff and careful but gradually softened as weeks passed. Diane completed her counseling requirements, took a part-time job at a fabric store near Sevierville, and wrote Patrick a letter every week, whether they had a scheduled visit or not, letters Marcy read aloud to him at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings. Craig, Patrick's brother, remained distant for the better part of a year, though he eventually sent a single, awkward message asking to meet. A first small step that Patrick accepted with more grace than Scott would have managed in his position. Patrick, for his part, became something of a fixture at club events, riding in Walt Bishop's sidecar at every charity run, greeting new members with the same open warmth that had first drawn Ellen Marsh and a dozen others to his side on that first long night. He kept the leather vest the club had made him, wearing it proudly, and he kept, too, the empty paper bag from that day, folded carefully in a drawer at Marcy's house, a strange keepsake that Marcy once asked him about. "Why do you keep that old thing?" she asked gently. "Because that's what I had," Patrick said, "when nobody else came. And then Scott came. And then everybody came." He smiled, the same steady, unguarded smile that had won over an entire community of strangers. "I don't need it anymore, but I like remembering." On the 1-year anniversary of the day Patrick was left at the Watt Road rest stop, the Blue Ridge Riders organized a smaller, quieter ride. No news cameras this time, no 500 engines, just the original members who had answered Scott's first message that long-ago Tuesday. They stopped at the same rest area, the same green metal bench where Patrick had once sat alone for hours, watching an exit ramp for a family that never returned. This time Patrick sat on that bench surrounded by friends, laughing at something Ellen said, the autumn light falling gold through the same pine trees, and Scott watched him from a few feet away, thinking about how strange and unpredictable kindness could be, how a single decision to stop his motorcycle, to sit down beside a stranger, had rippled outward into 500 engines, a fundraiser, a mother's slow path toward accountability, and most importantly, into a life that Patrick now got to build on his own terms, surrounded by people who had chosen and kept choosing to stay. "You okay, Patrick?" Scott asked, sitting down beside him on the bench, the same spot where it had all begun. Patrick looked at him, then out at the parking lot, at the motorcycles gleaming in the afternoon sun, at the people who had become, in the truest sense of the word, his family. "I'm home," Patrick said simply, and Scott understood that he did. Not mean Marcy's house, or Knoxville, or any single physical place at all. He meant this: the bench, the engines, the people who had answered a call for help and never stopped answering. He meant belonging, and for a man who had once been left behind, waiting for a family that chose not to return, that word, home, carried a weight and a wholeness that no rest stop bench could ever again take away.